Hi, I'm Jeremy, the Zoo Nerd, coming to you live from beautiful, rainy Los Angeles, California. Today is a very special critter chat, as we will be talking about my absolute #1 favorite animal, hippos. I have loved hippos since I was a kid, and people have asked me why, and I can't really completely explain it. As I learned more and became an adult, I kind of was able to figure that out. It's because they're really quite unique. They don't have close relatives. There's not anything that really acts or behaves quite like they do. They're often quite misunderstood, and they enjoy laying around in the sun and on the beach all day. Who doesn't love that? They also are kind of cranky, kind of sassy, and they're really intelligent. So all of those things really help me appreciate and love hippos. But we're going to talk about those today during our critter chat. So hold on, it's going to be a good time and a fun ride. First of all, the word hippopotamus is actually a Greek word that means river horse. And that's kind of a very odd thing for the Greeks to think, that it was a river horse. Definitely river, sure. Yeah, they live in rivers. And historically, they lived into rivers into North Africa along the Nile River. So it wouldn't have been unlikely for Greek explorers to see them. Definitely in their adventures in Egypt and throughout other parts of Africa. But the horse part is a bit confusing to me, other than they have kind of big mouths, well, they have really big mouths, and horses have kind of big mouths. So that could maybe be the horse idea. But river horse is kind of a name that stuck with them. Hippopotamus is the word that is used to describe them in most languages, and they are absolutely amazing. They were previously thought to be related to pigs, but now, under new genetic DNA testing, scientists are saying that their closest relatives are actually whales and dolphins. So that's really fascinating to me. Scientists in the evolution of different animals have explained that whales and dolphins have a land-based ancestor, as all mammals do. And the common ancestor for whales and dolphins and hippos goes back a long time to a semi-aquatic animal that kind of resembled a pig. And it's been millions of years since that family tree divided between the whales and dolphins and the hippos. But interestingly enough, they share a lot of weird kind of anatomical similarities. So like the bone structure of a hippo's front foot is remarkably similar to the bone structure in a whale's pectoral fin, which is pretty crazy because they don't really look like anything similar on the outside, but when you look at their skeletons, there's a lot of similarities in how they react. They also have a lot of similarities in some of their other adaptations, and throughout this critter chat, I'll talk a little bit about those, many of which are shared with the whales and the dolphins. To get into it though, there are 2 species of hippos. Most people are familiar with what is called the common hippo or the river hippo, but may be less familiar with its smaller cousin called the pygmy hippo. And although it's called a pygmy hippo, it is still a very large animal. We'll talk more about pygmy hippos at the end. We'll jump in and talk a lot about the common hippos, which are the hippos I'm more familiar with, and probably the hippos you're more familiar with. Hippos are incredibly long-lived animals. They can live between 40 and 50 years out in the wild, which is a pretty long time. And in a zoo setting, they can live into their 50s, and I think a couple have lived into their 60s, which is pretty remarkable. They are also huge animals. They can be as long as 14 feet, so that is longer than some cars, for sure. And a good-sized female usually weighs between 2,500 pounds to 3,500 pounds. And a good-sized male can be anywhere from about 4,000 pounds on up to 8,000, and some record holders have been in the 9,000 pound range. That's huge. That's approaching the same weight as a female African elephant. So definitely very big animals. They can also be about 5 feet tall. So I'm 6'1", so at their shoulder, hippos can be about to here on me. And that's a big animal, a really big animal, really thick and dense animal. Now, despite their size, they are actually very agile and can move at remarkable speeds both on land and in the water. They can run about 15 miles an hour, and you may think, that's not that fast. It is that fast. Usain Bolt, who runs a 4-minute mile, that's 15 miles an hour. That's how fast hippos are capable of running. So you probably won't outrun a hippo if you and a hippo were to have a race. The common river hippos are found today in Eastern Africa and a little bit in Central Africa and a little bit in Southern Africa. But really, East Africa, the countries of Kenya, Tanzania, and I believe it's Zambia, are the countries with the most hippos. Botswana also has a pretty decent population. But hippos can be found kind of throughout those countries, and they spend most of their day in the water. I don't blame them for that. I love water, even the water that's falling from the sky here in California. Although I'm not going to spend my day out in the water because it's pretty chilly here today. Hippos will usually be in the water about 16 hours of the day, and it's during that time they're looking somewhat what we would say is lazy. But it's really their time to sleep. It's their time to rest, it's their time to socialize, and it's their time to sleep when they are in the water. When they come out of the water, they split up. So they're very social in the water. When they come out at night, they split up, usually by themselves, or if it's a mom with her baby, sometimes two that get along really well will go off together in search for grass. That is what hippos eat. Despite their big, sharp teeth, they eat grass. And they will eat a lot of grass during the night, and they will wander up to 6 miles a day looking for that grass. I have a pretty great story about that. When I was in Africa, in the Masai Mara, so that is the area of Kenya just north of the country of Tanzania, that is part of the Serengeti ecosystem. So that's a huge, famous grassland area of Africa. And when we were in that area, we were staying in very nice, large tents. These are tents that have electricity and a toilet and a shower, so they were very nice tents. And the tent that I was staying in was the last tent in like a horseshoe shape of tents. We were furthest from the main building and furthest from the other tents. And the guards at the camp where we were staying told us absolutely, for whatever reason, do not come out of your tent at night. And I took that advice. That's smart advice from someone who works in Africa and is responsible for the safety of the tourists who are visiting. But during the night, something bumped our tent. Our very large tent, which had poles similar to this, something bumped that tent pole, and it shook the whole tent, and it woke me up. And I said to Gabe, who was with me, I said, something's out there. And it woke me up, and it's right outside our tent. And he said, what do you think it is? And I said, I don't know. And then we heard the sound. And I knew it was a hippo. And sure enough, in the morning, we looked around our tent and looked at the tracks that were in the mud. And yes, a hippo had visited our tent at the night. And it was eating the grass that grew all around where our tent was. Now, the thing that's remarkable about this, our camp was 5 miles from the closest water source. So that means that hippo came out of the river and walked 5 miles to get close to where we were camping to eat the grass. Was I scared? Yes, I was scared. I was worried that it would possibly push over the tent or possibly rip through the tent and possibly come after us. But what do? You patiently wait and be quiet and hope that that it doesn't come after you. So yeah, it was a really good time, and definitely made me love hippos even more because they're adventurous and they don't get pushed around much. Now, adult-sized hippos don't really have much for predators. Occasionally, a pride of lions might go after a hippo if they're really desperate, and if the hippo's already far from water and maybe old or sick or injured. And if it's by itself. If a hippo's in a group and if a hippo's in a river, nothing's gonna mess with it. Not a big one. I have seen video footage of lions successfully killing and eating a hippo, and it would be a very good meal that would last them a very long time, but it's a pretty risky hunt for the lions because hippos can be pretty good at defending themselves. Now that is a very different story for baby hippo. Baby hippos are vulnerable to a lot of different predators. The number one predator for a baby hippo is crocodiles. The crocodiles in Africa get huge. They have measured some crocodiles at nearly 20 feet. So those would be Nile crocodiles. They are considered the second largest crocodile in the world after the saltwater crocodiles. But those big crocodiles could definitely take away a baby hippo. But then they would have the rest of the hippos to deal with, so it's a pretty big risk. Other predators for baby hippos would be lions, hyenas, and leopards. But actually the most dangerous animal to a baby hippo are other hippos. And that's because hippos can get pretty cranky and they can have pretty good little fights between each other. And sometimes the babies unfortunately get in the way and get pushed around, get stepped on, or may get squished in the process. Again, those parent hippos, those adult hippos are very big. And if it's a big crowded group, the little babies might get pushed around a little much. Now the babies, they are born after an 8-month gestation period or pregnancy. So that's shorter than humans, but those babies are usually born in the like 60 to 100 pound range. So they are very big babies. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Fiona, the hippo that was born at the Cincinnati Zoo, but she was actually born premature. She weighed 36 pounds, and they were very worried about her because she was too little for a newborn baby hippo. But more on her later. I'll share her story on the Facebook profile. She's a great hippo. But the adult hippos have really big teeth. Male hippo teeth, or tusks, can be 20 inches in length, and there's top pair and a bottom pair in their mouth, and they rub against each other as their mouths close, and that sharpens the teeth. And so they can be pretty sharp, and they're about that big around, and that can be a really good weapon. The males use that when they're fighting with each other, and those fights can sometimes be pretty deadly between male hippos. They fight for territory and for breeding rights, and I don't know, push each other around sometimes if someone's in the best spot to sit in the river to get some sun. Hippos, actually, despite their size and despite the amount of time they spend in water, they actually cannot swim. Who knew, right? They can't swim. They also cannot float. You would think, oh, maybe they can't swim because they're too fat and they float. No, their body is really thick and dense, but it's not all fat. They're actually so heavy that they just sink to the bottom. So when they're in the water, they actually kind of run along the bottom of the river and kind of push with their feet to come up to the surface and then go back down. There's a really great video from the San Diego Zoo of a baby hippo doing that, and I'll try to find that and put it up on the Facebook profile later. But they can hold their breath for about 5 minutes at a time, which is impressive for a big animal like that. Oh, also with their breath, so they only have, they have a lung, very different development than most mammals have for lungs. Their lung definitely represents more the lungs of dolphins and whales, which I mentioned earlier are their closest relatives. So that's one of those real big differences. Let's see, where were we talking about other things? Their vocalization. So I demonstrated one of those earlier. That's really the only one I know. But they have pretty complex language that they share with each other. Most of those that we hear most often are kind of warning calls or calls saying, hey, leave me alone, that they would use to intimidate other animals. And there are a lot of sounds that they can make that we cannot hear. It's below our level of frequency. But the really fascinating thing to me about hippo language is that they speak two languages. They speak a language above the water that we hear all the time, and they speak a different language underwater. And they are the only mammal that's known to do that. And it's really quite fascinating. I watched a really amazing documentary on a researcher who is specifically studying hippo communication. And he has a hydrophone or a microphone that he puts under the water. And he's been able to track what different sounds mean. So their danger call that they make above water is very different than the danger call they make for underwater. Therefore, they are bilingual animals. Isn't that amazing? They also have really stiff whiskers or bristles on their face, and that can help them find things in the dark water, or on the land when they're looking for grass at night. In working with hippos in a zoo setting for a while when I was a zookeeper at the Los Angeles Zoo, some of the animals I got to help take care of were the hippos. And I always loved to touch the hippos on the front of their face and feel their whiskers, because they're very sensitive to them, like a cat's whiskers. And they would appreciate that little rub. And they loved to interact with their keepers. So that was always a fun spot to be able to touch them. Hippos are very social, so that's why they're able to communicate so much. And they typically live in groups of 10 to 20 individuals. But in big rivers where there's a nice big landscape, they have been seen in groups of 200 individuals. That would also happen in times when there's a drought and there's not much water. Different groups start to go to wherever the water is, and that sometimes ends to territorial brawls between the individuals saying, hey, this is my space, and the others are like, it's the only space with water right now, let us in. And so it gets a little confrontational with them, for sure. At night when and a group of hippos is called either a bloat or a pod, which is kind of a fun word. Sometimes the word herd is used for them. That is a common word used for most animals with hoofs. Sorry, had a little connection issue. We're back. But the hippos at night when they're eating their grass, they can eat about 80 pounds of grass a day, or during a night actually, which may sound like a lot, but given their size, that's actually only between 1% and 2% of their body weight a day. So that's significantly less than like humans usually eat in a day, and definitely less than a lot of other herbivores or plant-eating animals could eat in a day. What else? Hippos are listed as vulnerable to extinction, and that's kind of a recent thing. They were kind of listed as a safe, stable population up until about 5, maybe 10 years ago. That changed to being vulnerable. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute when we talk about their threats. One other thing that's really cool, we talked about this with beavers a couple days ago. Hippos also have a clear eyelid that can close over their eyes for when they're underwater. That's called a nictitating membrane. Really amazing. A lot of mammals that spend time underwater have that, but they can actually open and close that to kind of, it's like putting goggles on, helps you see better when you're swimming in a pool or a lake or the ocean. One thing that's really crazy that always amazed early explorers and early scientists about hippos is that they don't typically sweat like other animals do. They have this fluid that comes out of their skin, out of the pores on their skin, that looks like blood, but it is not. They've done comprehensive testing on it. They call it blood sweat, and it looks like blood. It's red, it's liquidy. It's kind of a little bit gelatinous or jelly-like. And in working with the hippos at the zoo, it would come out quite a bit if they had been maybe in the water and then came out into the sun and were out of the water for a while in the sun on a hot day. That would start to come out of their skin. Something that I thought was really interesting about it is if we then rubbed their skin, that would go from being like a blood color to looking like lather soap or shampoo. It would turn white and foamy. But that's called blood sweat, and it helps moisturize and protect their skin from the sun. And scientists are still researching, but they think that it has antibacterial and anti-infection properties. Hippos, when they tear each other up with those big teeth, rarely get infected. And if they get cut up by a lion or a crocodile or something, those wounds rarely get infected, which is pretty amazing considering that there's a lot of bacteria and other debris in the water that they typically are in that could cause a lot of problems. Now, speaking about some of that bacteria that is in the water, hippo poop, we have to talk about it. It's an important part of hippo culture. I was really amazed in Africa when we went to the river and we were driving along in the trucks and we came around this bend, and this was on our morning game drive. And around this bend under some trees by the edge of a big river, we had a bunch of tables that they'd set up for us to have breakfast in the bush. But this breakfast in the bush overlooked a riverbank, and in the river were hippos. So I skipped breakfast because I wanted to watch the hippos. And I took what was left at the end of breakfast, and everybody thought I was crazy, but I had to get as much hippo time in as I could. But I was really amazed at the trails that lead from the river to the land, and the way that the hippos would come in and out of the river astonished me. Here's this big lumbering fat animal, and the trails that they would walk up and down to get in and out of the river, it was about 30 feet difference in height from where I was standing to down to the river where they were. And it was pretty steep, to the point that I would honestly have had trouble coming up it for sure, and possibly going down it. It was a steep trail, and there's this little winding trail that the hippos would use, and at the bottom of the trail, it was that wide. And here's this animal that's about 3 or 4 feet wide, that has big feet, and the trail is only this wide at the bottom. Now it's a little bit bigger just up from that because their huge body has to fit through the dirt. But you could see the hippo trail had been carved by lots of hippos going in and out of this river for many, many years. And the bushes that grew on the sides of this trail were covered in dried up hippo poop. If you've ever seen a male hippo mark his territory, it is something pretty amazing. It is also something to take a good step back from. To mark their territory, they poop, and their tail spins around like this. And that throws the poop all over all the bushes. But that is how the male hippos say, hey, this spot of the river, this grass that grows here, that's mine. And I'm gonna poop on it to let everybody know. Now, I learned this the hard way when I was a kid. We were at the zoo in Utah, in Salt Lake City, and we were watching a hippo walk down the stairs to get into his pool. And me and my brother stuck our heads right over the railing, and we're leaning down to watch the hippo walk down into the pool. And the hippo decided to mark his territory and claim the pool as his, although of course it would be his, it's where he lived. But he pooped and he flipped his tail around and around, and guess where all that hippo poop went? On us. Yeah, so I ended up with a little spot right here and a little spot right here. So can I say that I've eaten hippo poop? No, not really. But have I had it on my face? Absolutely. And hippos, as being vegetarians, that's gonna smell and kind of look a bit like maybe a cow poop or horse poop. But it's gonna be a lot more liquidy than either of those animals. But fun and exciting things with hippo poop. I know some of the kids really enjoy hearing about poop, so that's the poop story for you today. Now we're gonna talk a little bit about the smaller hippo species, the pygmy hippos. So they are quite a bit smaller than their big cousins, but they are still big animals. Somebody says, oh, my sister's watching today, and she says she tasted the hippo poop, so she got some in her mouth that day. Good times, huh, Jen? Okay, so moving on to pygmy hippos. Although they are quite a bit smaller than their cousins, they are still big animals. So a full-grown pygmy hippo can weigh between 350 pounds to up to 600 pounds. So they're really not that tall. They're probably about 40 inches tall. Yeah, maybe only 36, about 3 feet tall. And they're probably about 4 feet in length. So they're not that big, but they're pretty heavy. They also have really long legs. And they live in a very different habitat than the big common hippos do. The pygmy hippos live in the jungle. So they live in the rainforest of West Africa, specifically mostly in the forest in a small country called Liberia. They live a little bit in the countries that surround that, called the Ivory Coast, Guyana, and Sierra Leone. But Liberia is their big homeland for the pygmy hippos. Now in their home, they live in the jungle, so it's lots of plants, lots of trees, lots of bushes, and there's a lot of water because it's a rainforest, but water is usually in very small, like streams, not so much big rivers or big lakes in the area where the hippos live. So they are less aquatic than their big cousins. They love mud, so they'll kind of find a shallow spot in one of those areas and lay in the mud during the day. They are also more active at night, so more nocturnal. And they are also more solitary, so they live in very small groups. Sometimes you'll see 2 or 3 together, but probably not more than that. And honestly, you probably won't see them because they're pretty rare and they're pretty unknown. So for the scientists, they didn't even know about these animals until 1840, which is pretty long for a pretty good-sized animal in Africa. Their babies are also quite a bit smaller. They're pregnant for about 6 to 7 months, or their gestation. And then their babies are between 8 and 14 pounds. And when they're born, they're a little bit bigger than like a watermelon. So they're really adorable baby pygmy hippos. I'll find some photos and put those up later. Pygmy hippos don't live quite as long either. They kind of live into their late 20s, early 30s. I believe some record holders have made it to 40, but not nearly as long. Like I said, they're very shy, they're very rare, and they're also very endangered. The pygmy hippos are estimated to only be about 2,000 to 3,000 individuals left in the wild. Nobody really knows how many of the common hippos there are because they're a little difficult to count because they spend so much time in the water, and that's kind of hard that nobody's taken on the task to really count hippos. Other than they've said that they're pretty common, but they're not as common as they used to be. The pygmy hippos also eat a few other things besides grass. They will also eat leaves, roots, ferns, and the fruit off of the forest trees. They love to eat that. And they are very cool looking. They look kind of like a big hippo, but instead of eyes on top of their head. Oh, that's another thing that hippos have really well adaptations for a life in water. With the big hippos, their nostrils, their ears, and their eyes are all on the top of their head, so they can be almost totally underwater with just those 3 things sticking up. Pygmy hippos are a little different. Their eyes are kind of further back on their head, not so forward looking, and their heads are a little more rounded up. Someone's asking if it's because of humans that pygmy hippos are endangered. Yes, always. Always, always, always. If animals are endangered, it's because humans. We're constantly screwing things up around the planet due to our lack of respect for the other animals that live here and the things that they need. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about the threats that face pygmy hippos and the big common hippos. So the biggest threat for both of them is humans developing the land and changing the landscape. So in Africa, that's things like building dams and blocking up a river and then flooding a whole valley, you would think, oh, but hippos like the water. That might be good for them. Well, it might be good, except they can't swim. So if the water's too deep, they can't get across it. And so they may hang out on the edges of that new lake that's been formed, but they can't go across it because it would be too deep in the middle. Plus, if you flood a whole area by building a dam, you're now taking away all that grass that used to be there that they needed for their food. So that's a big thing, is development and messing up their habitat. And also with that comes pollution. As humans move further into other areas, that can degrade the habitat, cause toxic chemicals from things like mining into the water that can cause lots of problems for them. Also, in some places where they divert a river or start using it more for irrigation or farming, that can cause a drought downriver where there's not enough water for them. The next big issue for hippos is climate change. That's an issue for a lot of animals on the globe. As those temperatures warm up around the world, caused by pollution from like gasoline factories, burning of coal, all of those energy producing things, that causes the temperatures to rise around the world, and then that starts to mess with the weather patterns. And that has caused a lot of problems in Africa with things like droughts and fires and famines. And also it sometimes causes big bad flooding. I know of a hippo that got washed out to sea. That was a baby hippo. It was in the river. Big flood came down the river. It separated it from its mom and its dad. And they found it about 50 miles out to sea. Some fishermen found a baby hippo. And they luckily were able to rescue it, and they brought it back to an animal sanctuary, and the people there were able to save its life, luckily. But yeah, all sorts of human-caused problems with the environment can cause lots of problems with the hippos. Someone is asking, how do they chase boats if they can't swim? I've seen videos of them attacking. Excellent question. So there's a really amazing video of that. I'll see if I can find that and put it up. So the one that I know, there's a very big hippo chasing a pretty fast boat. And the hippo disappears every so often and then comes back up. The water's not very shallow. So it's going down, touching the bottom and pushing up with its legs and coming up, getting breath. And it's chasing the boat, coming down, hitting the bottom, going back up. Constantly doing this. They're really good at doing that, and they can pretty much run through the water. They're very big and strong, muscular animals, despite the fact that they kind of just look fat. They're very big, very strong. The other big problem with hippos is people want ivory. They like it, they think it's pretty, and they've been killing elephants for it for thousands of years. Well, about 25, 30 years ago, that kind of started to slow down quite a bit. It's recently gone back up, unfortunately. But when it started to go down, people said, okay, fine, we won't kill the elephants for the ivory. We'll get our ivory somewhere else. And the somewhere else happened to be hippos. So they are now killing hippos for those big teeth. And they'll carve the hippo teeth into little trinkets that people put on a shelf in their house. And that's a pretty sad reason to kill an animal, in my opinion. But hunted for their ivory is a real problem for the big hippos, for the common hippos. Now the little ones are also hunted, but they're hunted because people are eating them. And often you may think, oh, they have to eat, which is true, but then they're selling them to restaurants to be served to tourists who want to try something unique and exciting while they're visiting Africa. So if you go to Africa, I highly encourage you to be cautious with what you're eating. Do not eat things that are endangered. And if you're going to Africa, figure out what those endangered animals are that are in the place where you're visiting, so you make sure you don't eat them while you're there. All right, so how can people help hippos? With a lot of animals, there's really great charitable organizations that you can help that support conservation. Usually those are specifically around one type of animal. Sometimes it's around a specific place. Unfortunately for hippos, there is not a good organization out there yet. Maybe someday I'll start one. Who knows? We'll see. But the big thing that can help hippos is protecting land, protecting big chunks of land and habitat that they need. So those are things like national parks or wilderness preserves and sanctuaries that save a big group of land and allow lots of different animals to be on there. Someone is asking, are piano keys still made out of ivory? For the most part, no. If you find an old piano, you may find some that have ivory on them. But ivory has been officially illegal across the world since the late 80s. There are some countries that did not sign that agreement, so they have continued to trade ivory. Some of those kind of have gone back and forth a couple times on that. Is it legal? Is it illegal? And they've gone back and forth. There's several countries in Africa that are trying to make ivory trade legal again. They want the money, and they have a lot of elephants right now. So that's that's the way their government's looking at it. But to my knowledge, most piano keys are not made out of ivory. If it's an old piano, there's a good chance that it could be. All right, so our special shout out today is going to be two different zoos that have done some really amazing stuff with the hippos at their facilities. One is the San Diego Zoo. I'm actually really good friends with the zookeeper that takes care of the hippos there, or takes care of the big hippos there. And they feature their hippos quite a bit in social media and videos, and so I'll be sharing some of those later today. The San Diego Zoo is also one of the few zoos I'm aware of where there are both the common hippo and the pygmy hippo. So most zoos have one or the other. Not a lot of zoos have both. Although the zoo in Berlin that I went to in Germany did have both as well, and that was amazing to see. Also the Cincinnati Zoo. Cincinnati Zoo really had an amazing experience a couple years ago when they had a baby hippo born who was premature. Her name is Fiona. She still lives there. She's about 2 years old now, I believe. She was premature and only weighed 36 pounds. Baby common hippos usually weigh at least like 60 pounds. So she was only about half the weight she should have been. And so people had to raise her, and they had to really take care of her for quite a while before they could get her to a point where she could go back with her parents. But Fiona's now doing great, and hats off to the Cincinnati zookeepers who did amazing work taking care of her. In my experience with hippos, they are one of the animals where I have worked closely with them as a zookeeper, and I have seen them in their wild habitat. And any animal that does both those things for me is usually something I really appreciate and am amazed by, because I've been able to work with them up close and personal to where they know me, respond to me, but also I've been able to see how their wild relatives live their life. And to me, that is an amazing thing to be able to experience, and I'm very grateful for those opportunities in my life. Working with hippos is truly an amazing time. They're very smart, they're very charismatic, they know their people, they're very smart. The main hippo keeper at the Los Angeles Zoo has gotten the mom hippo to be able to lift her foot up and put it down onto an x-ray pad so they can do x-rays on her feet. They've also trained her to hold very still while they do a blood draw, which involves sticking a very sharp needle into her tail to get blood so they can do blood work on her. And that's pretty rare that an animal will voluntarily hold still while it gets poked by a needle. I know a lot of people who won't do that. So hippos are really smart, and if you work with them, you can get great training like that accomplished. And so amazing animals, the hippos. So that concludes our critter chat today. I'll be putting up a lot of things about hippos on the Facebook page. And if you would like, there is on the Zoo Nerd Facebook profile, there's a community group section you can join. I hope that that can grow and become a place where we can share homework ideas, pictures kids draw, reports kids write, all sorts of fun things like that. So check that out as well. Request to join if you're not already a member of that. And as always, feel free to like, subscribe, follow, and share any of the Zoo Nerd content on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Until tomorrow, I will see you then. Have a great day. Love and enjoy hippos. See you later.